Do you think Kevin McCarthy's going to watch this? Like now that he has all this free time on his hands? I don't know what McCarthy's going to do with his time, but in the days before he lost his job, Donald Trump hey, Pop, what's up?
Edie, what are you doing?
Do I have to leash you and tie you to a fence post?
Edie. Alrighty, well, let's try this again.
I don't know what McCarthy's going to do with his time, but in the days before he lost his job, Donald Trump was on this like record-breaking streak of encouraging violence and murder. So he wants Mark Milley, who was his own top general, put to death. He wants people to quote unquote go after New York Attorney General Letitia James. He had this whole bit about how in his second term, petty criminals can expect to be shot. But you're not imagining things if you think it's weird that the political system and the political news media in particular underreacted to these outbursts. And it's not just us. The Washington Post media reporter Paul Farhi published a really great report last week about how Trump's violent rhetoric is getting muted coverage by the news media. And his thesis is essentially that journalists have grown a little bored of it after so many years. They're desensitized. They expect this behavior of Donald Trump so it doesn't register to them as news. And I don't think he's wrong about that. And I've written and spoken at length about how reporters need to develop new mental habits around Trump so that they recognize when he says something outrageous and then make good judgments about whether it's just a pure distraction or if it's actually something newsworthy. Because in all fairness, it's natural. Like journalists are human. They are going to acclimate to their environments. But I don't think it's the only dynamic at play here. There's another one, and it falls under the heading of the larger incentive journalists feel to draw false equivalences between the parties. So that includes things we've already talked about, like both sides do it, and he said, she said. This isn't one of those exactly. It's different. It's a kind of normalization. You've probably heard that term so much since Donald Trump first ran for president that you're probably bored or desensitized to it. But there's something novel here. Political news has been doing the false equivalency thing forever, but the normalization phenomenon really took hold, I think, in 2016 when Trump was just a candidate. And he was so aberrant and he was at the center of so many scandals that political journalists, if they were really committed to emphasizing only the most salient issues for voters, it would have just been reporting derogatory information about Trump all the time. But mainstream news desks just aren't built to do that. There's an old ethic, and it's generally sensible, that they should apply equal scrutiny to both parties and each major party candidate. What's less reasonable is using resources like airtime or front page column space or whatever as a proxy for scrutiny. You have two candidates, you have to spend as much time being adversarial to one as to the other. And in 2016, what that meant was on one side, a bunch of ping-ponging between the dozens of Donald Trump scandals, and on the other, this sort of relentless focus on Hillary Clinton and her emails. And the effect was to skew public perception about the candidates and their ethics. Trump's unprecedented corruption was normalized, Hillary Clinton's ordinary political controversies were abnormalized, and ta-da, a false equivalence was born. And we know that journalists know that the equivalence was false because then Trump barged into office, broke every records protocol and information security protocol known to man, and it just did not generate front page news coverage like this. Now it's 7 years later and something similar is happening. Joe Biden seems all clear on the email server front, but the equal scrutiny rule still applies. So we've seen a lot of breathless coverage of his son Hunter, who's under indictment on federal gun charges, and also of how Joe Biden's very old. While Trump's many liabilities make him a moving target. He's under a bunch of indictments. His business might be dissolved. He's divulging state secrets to some Australian billionaire, and he's leveling death threats left and right. And so no one of those things gets lasting drumbeat coverage. And the result is that the country is more or less evenly divided over who's the more ethical candidate, Trump or Biden, when if you took a blind poll of political journalists in Washington, it'd be nearly unanimous. Trump wins the corruption sweepstakes in a walk. But it is not that journalists are sitting around thinking, gosh, like Trump is just so much worse than everyone else, so we need to normalize him and abnormalize his opponents so we can pretend they're similar. It's nothing like that at all. It just spills out of the formula, right? But the formula doesn't just apply to negative stories. Similar pressures also apply to the issue of when and how to cover positive stories about politicians. There's at least some pressure to be fair, to present well-rounded profiles of newsmakers. There's also pressure to prove, we're not what our critics say. We're not in the tank for Democrats, and we don't unfairly target Republicans. During the Trump years, that meant balancing out this dutiful coverage of things like the Russia investigation or the first impeachment and all the Trump scandals with this relentlessly positive coverage of the economy. Now that we have a different president from the other party, the one that isn't always attacking the news media, here's how they're covering an even stronger economy. This was literally just last week when the Labor Department released its September jobs report. I promise you those headlines are real, and this kind of thing has been going on for years now. So that's the fuller answer to the question of why Donald Trump can threaten his nemesis with political violence, and it doesn't rise to the level of scandal. Boredom, desensitization, those are part of the story, but they're not the whole story. Got that, Kevin McCarthy?